Asaph stood at the edge of the temple courtyard. He watched the wealthy pass by, their hands full of gold, their movements effortless and sure. He looked down at his own palms, empty and calloused. The righteous around him suffered in silence, yet those who trampled the law thrived. Every step the oppressors took seemed to mock the very order of the world. Asaph felt the tension in his jaw. His faith, once a steady anchor, began to fray under the pressure of the injustice before him. He turned his eyes to the ground, trying to block out the sight of their prosperity. The noise of the courtyard, the chatter, the clinking of coins, the laughter pressed against his ears like a physical weight. He moved toward the sanctuary doors. He pushed them open and stepped inside. The heavy wood groaned, then clicked into place behind him, cutting off the world. The silence was absolute. He stopped looking for the gold of men. He lifted his head, turning his gaze toward the horizon of eternity, and felt the first cold, sharp spark of truth pierce through the dark fog of his doubt. The silence did not last. A sudden, rhythmic thudding shook the floor, the sound of iron against stone. Outside, the city walls buckled. Smoke curled through the cracks of the sanctuary doors before the wood itself splintered inward. Torches flew through the air, landing in the curtains, the flames climbing the walls with hungry speed. The people huddled in the center, their eyes fixed on the charred beams collapsing above them. They did not run. They lifted their voices, a collective, jagged sound of grief that cut through the roar of the fire. They held their pain aloft like a shield, a raw appeal to the one who watched from beyond the smoke. The scene shifted. The heat of the fire faded into the cold, crystalline air of a throne room. A single gavel struck the stone. The sound echoed through the halls of history, sharp and final. God stood as the judge. The power of the arrogant crumbled under that singular heavy strike. The humble were raised. The balance of the world tilted, and the pride of nations withered in the face of the encroaching light. The iron boots of the marching nations struck the earth, a thunderous cadence that promised only ruin. Then, the voice of God spoke. It was not a shout, but a vibration that traveled through the bedrock of the world. The earth stood still. The momentum of the invaders collapsed, their power evaporating into the quiet, heavy security of the Lord. Yet, the peace did not reach the mind of the rider. He wandered into a desert of his own making, a vast, dry expanse where his questions circled like vultures. He looked for answers, but found only the shifting sands of his own doubt. The sky above him held no stars. He pushed forward, his resolve flagging, until his memory caught on a jagged edge of history. He saw the Red Sea. He felt the spray of salt water against his face and heard the roar of the surf as it split in two. The waves stood like walls of polished glass, towering and immobile, while his ancestors walked across the dry, sandy bed. The sight burned in his mind, a brilliant, unwavering lighthouse cutting through the darkness of his internal storm. He focused on that light, letting the ancient miracle anchor his spirit as the desert wind began to die down. The vision of the sea faded, replaced by the warmth of a hearth. Parents sat with their children, the long, brittle scroll of history unrolled across their laps. They traced the ink with shaking fingers, pointing to the jagged records of Israel's rebellion. They spoke of the golden idols, the murmurs in the wilderness, and the repeated turning away from the source of their life. Each story was a warning, a physical marker in the dirt to keep the next generation from walking the same path. The children watched, their eyes wide as the weight of the past settled into the room. Yet, the story did not end in condemnation. The parents turned the page to the account of mercy, showing how the Creator reached into the cycle of collapse to pull them back. They spoke of the failures of the past, not to bury the future, but to clear the ground for a new beginning. They told of the shepherd boy, David, pulled from the fields to lead. It was a choice made not because the people were whole, but because grace insisted on remaining. Even as the history of the nation fractured, the promise held firm, a quiet, enduring thread woven through the wreckage of human choice. The legacy of the past gave way to the smoke of the present. Jerusalem lay in ruins, its limestone walls reduced to piles of blackened rubble. Survivors picked through the debris, their faces streaked with soot, their eyes searching the horizon for a sign that did not come. The national spirit felt like a vine once lush and sprawling across the hillside, now hacked back to the root by the sharp edge of its own rebellion. The branches were dry, the leaves curled and brittle. There was no shade left, only the harsh glare of a sun that beat down on the exposed, broken stalks. The people gathered in the shadow of the fallen sanctuary, clutching the remnants of their identity. They did not bow their heads in finality. Instead, they stood, hands raised, voices cutting through the silence of the wasteland. They cried out for the gardener. They begged for the hand that had once planted them to return and tend the soil, to clear the weeds of their own making, and to shield the remaining stem from the scorching heat. They acknowledged the pruning was their own doing, yet they clung to the hope that the roots still held life, waiting for the touch that could make the vine green once more. The cries of the vine echoed into the cold halls of judgment. Psalm 82 shattered the silence, a sharp, unyielding demand for justice. The weak were being trampled in the streets, their rights bartered away by those who held the gavel but lacked the heart to use it. The plea rose from the dust, calling for an end to the exploitation of the poor. It was a roar of conscience against the status quo. As the demand for righteousness hung in the air, the perspective shifted from the city square to the quiet, inner chambers of the soul. The wanderer stopped looking at the ruins and began to look upward. A singular, burning hunger took hold. He measured the value of his days, weighing the gold of the world against the stillness of the holy place. He calculated the cost of 1,000 lifetimes spent in the halls of men, only to conclude they were worth less than a single sunrise in the courts of God. His pulse quickened at the thought of the sanctuary. He did not want comfort, he wanted proximity. He stood at the threshold of his own desperation, realizing that even if the walls of his life were stripped bare, the presence of the Creator was the only home that could never be broken. The light of the sanctuary dimmed, replaced by a shadow that stretched across the floor. Psalm 88 began, not with a chorus, but with a low, steady pulse of exhaustion. The wanderer walked away from the halls of light and descended into the valley. Here, the air turned thin and sharp. He reached out, but his hands met only the cold stone of the cavern walls. Darkness became his closest companion. It sat with him, breathed with him, and watched as he poured his questions into the void. He did not seek a quick resolution. He did not ask for a sudden sunrise to chase the fog away. Instead, he sat in the center of the silence, letting the weight of his grief press against his chest. His voice cracked as he spoke. Each word a heavy stone dropped into a deep well. There was no attempt to mask the pain or hide behind poetic platitudes. He laid his suffering bare, exposing the raw nerve of his abandonment. He learned that some prayers are not meant to be answered in the moment, but to be held in the dark. He remained in the valley, proving that the deepest form of trust is found when the heart refuses to stop speaking, even when the heavens remain silent. The valley of shadows retreated, replaced by a sudden, blinding flash of gold. Psalm 89 opened with the roar of a coronation. The throne of David stood at the center of the world, anchored by ancient promises and carved from the bedrock of eternity. The scepter glowed with the weight of divine authority. It was a vision of absolute order, a bastion of stability that seemed eternal. Then, the vision splintered. A sound like grinding stone ripped through the air. The gold tarnished in an instant. The pillars of the throne room buckled, bowing under an unseen pressure until the roof groaned and collapsed. The heavy doors were torn from their hinges. Where there was once a seat of power, there was only dust. The crown rolled across the floor, coming to rest in a pile of jagged rubble. The kingdom had been unmade. Walls were shattered. Roads were choked with debris, and the banners of the house of David were shredded by the wind. The silence that followed was not one of peace, but of a hollow, suffocating absence. The reality of the ruins stood stark and immovable. The promise had been written in the heavens, but the earth was now a graveyard of broken stone, leaving the observer to stare into the wreckage of everything he once believed was permanent. The writer knelt in the center of the debris. His right hand remained clamped tight around the scroll of the covenant, the parchment rough against his calloused skin. His left hand pressed deep into the cold, jagged dust of the fallen throne. He felt the sharp grit of the ruin biting into his palm. He did not pull away. He did not drop the scroll to wipe the dirt from his hands. Instead, he forced his body to remain upright, bracing his weight against the ground. The promise of an eternal kingdom pulled one way. The reality of the shattered walls pulled the other. He felt the strain in his shoulders, the tension in his jaw, and the pulse of his own blood keeping time with his resolve. He looked at the wreckage and then at the script, his eyes moving from the broken stone to the ink. He refused to let go of either. He sat in the center of the contradiction, his knuckles white, his posture rigid. He was a bridge between the devastation and the decree. He held his pain up against the light of the ancient oath, refusing to look away or surrender the tension. He simply waited, locked in a silent, defiant hold that defied the collapse of everything around him. The wind whistled through the gaps in the broken masonry, carrying the scent of dry earth. The rider remained motionless. The contradiction that had torn at his composure began to settle, not because the ruins were rebuilt, but because his perspective shifted. He watched the light move across the jagged stones, illuminating the cracks and the debris. The world was undeniably broken, a landscape of collapsed ambitions and shattered stone. Yet, as he traced the ink on the ancient scroll, the truth solidified. The kingdom had fallen, but the source of the promise had not moved. He exhaled, the sound thin and sharp in the empty hall. He stopped bracing his muscles against the weight of the wreckage. He simply sat. The chaos of the city outside and the destruction within the sanctuary lost their power to dictate his state. He recognized the character of the Creator as a fixed point, a mountain that did not erode under the storms of history. The dust settled on his shoulders, coating him in the debris of the past, but his eyes remained clear. He set the scroll down upon the leveled ground. The struggle reached its end, replaced by a quiet, steady rhythm of breathing. The world was a ruin, but the foundation remained. He stood up, turned away from the rubble, and walked into the stillness.